attack on the USA. 4 airliners are hijacked, turned into devastating bombs. Thousands of people are feared dead.
I hope I live. It's coming down on me.
The world, shaken, recoils in horror. This is a special extended edition of The National. Good evening. I'm Peter Mansbridge in Toronto on a night like no other. The world is in shock tonight. The United States on high alert. The result of terror attacks never seen before. Audacious and devastating. A calamity witnessed by millions this morning on television. At 8:45, hijackers crashed an airliner into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York. Just 20 minutes later, a second plane plowed into the South Tower. Smoke and flames shot above. Debris and the doomed fell below. Then, around 9:40, another explosion, this time in Washington. Another hijacked plane hit the Pentagon. And just after 10 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed and vanished in a cloud of dust, soon followed by the other building.
I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car.
At 10:10 a.m., a 4th airplane crashed outside of Pittsburgh. The images are extraordinary, the impact only beginning. It's impossible to know the number of casualties, whether they're in the hundreds, the thousands, or the tens of thousands. But one thing is certain, New York City is changed tonight, from the mood of its people to the look of its skyline. Reporter Steve Irwin is in Manhattan tonight. Steve.
Peter, New York's nightmare began just as most people were coming into work, when a hijacked passenger plane flew straight into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Smoke poured out of the skyscraper, and the scene was a mess. Then, less than 30 minutes later, it happened again.
Oh my God!
A second plane was hijacked, and as people around the world watched on television, it flew straight into the other tower, punching a huge hole through the building.
And I heard a roar, and I looked around thinking that it had to be a helicopter, and I looked up and I saw the second plane hit. Had to be a commercial-sized airliner.
What went through your mind?
That it couldn't be real. Just that it couldn't be real.
We thought it was an accident. When we heard there was a second one, we definitely thought it was terrorism at that point.
There are typically some 50,000 people working every day in these 110-story buildings. Those inside began to flee while emergency workers rushed in a frenzy to the scene.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion, and everybody just started running for the door. Everybody was trapped. Eventually, when the dust lifted, I saw some light and started screaming for everybody to go out towards the light.
As soon as it got hit, I was thrown to a window. So I was very lucky to get out. There's a lot of people that didn't get out. There's a lot of people coming down the stairs, burnt up. It's bad.
Were there other people that were hurt, were lying
there? There was a lot of people hurt. They were lying on the floors, coming down the stairs. A lot of people had asthma attacks while they were coming down. It was bad.
A big explosion happened. Some guy came out. His skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
Well, the firefighter, somebody with little light came eventually, and we were following him.
And go to.
What did you do? I'm sorry.
The police officer told everybody to form a human chain, and we held on to each other, and he flashed the light, and he directed us to Building 5, and we went out Building 5.
Did you see people bleeding, and what did you see?
Oh, everybody could see. You want blood? Here's blood. Everybody's bleeding. People are laying all over the floor. It's horrible. And I was there the first time, and this is twice.
But there was an even greater catastrophe. The South Tower, its steel beams apparently melting from heat and fuel, collapsed on itself.
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car.
Unbelievably, a half hour later, that scene too repeated itself. Floor after floor of falling debris. Billowing smoke and soot seemed to cover the lower portion of Manhattan Island. There was panic everywhere. And late this afternoon, word that another building at the World Trade Center complex has collapsed. New York officials were stunned and somber.
And we will strive now very hard to save as many people as possible and to send a message that the city of New York and the United States of America is much stronger than any group of barbaric terrorists.
New York was brought to a standstill today. Financial markets, the subways, even the United Nations, all closed, and could be again tomorrow. Peter?
Thanks, Steve. Steve Irwin reporting for us tonight from New York City. And New York was just the beginning, as the horror of what happened at the World Trade Center was still just starting to sink in. Reports started coming in from Washington of explosions and fireballs. Then the chilling news that a passenger jet had crashed into the Pentagon, leaving a gaping hole in the military nerve center of the U.S. The CBC's Adrienne Arsenault joins us for that story. Adrienne.
Peter, this is a very somber Washington, D.C. right now. We're about 2 blocks from the White House. We're surrounded by government buildings, and security here is extremely tight because this is a city now in a state of emergency as the hundreds of thousands of people who work here were sent home earlier in the panic of this unbelievable day.
Before their eyes, the terror of New York flew into their own backyard. At 9:45 a.m., an explosion at the Pentagon.
And the next thing I know, there was this tremendous explosion as it hit the Pentagon. I looked right.
The military nerve center of the United States, workplace of more than 20,000 people, under attack. A hijacked American Airlines 757 with 64 people on board had just left Dulles, Virginia, en route to Los Angeles. Then it changed course and crashed into the West Wing. All 5 floors collapsed.
And an enormous gap has been cut in this building.
Mercifully, Pentagon officials say, the plane hit a newly renovated and minimally staffed section of the building. But death here would be unavoidable. As the effects of the escalating catastrophe started to sink in, the United States military at home and overseas was put on the highest alert. And in Washington, a state of emergency was declared.
Everybody back. Everybody back.
The White House, the Capitol building, all empty. And by mid-morning, every federal building in Washington was evacuated, sending nearly 250,000 people into the streets. Across town, early, unconfirmed reports of an explosion at or near the State Department. On any other day, that would be crisis enough. Here, today, it just gets added to a horrible list.
Very angry. Very angry that somebody has such callous disregard for human life.
And it would continue. Just before noon, a 4th commercial jet crashed just outside Pittsburgh. A passenger aboard the United Airlines plane had called police to report a hijacking, only moments before it went down in a cornfield.
I happened to hear a plane come through. It sounded like it was running normal. When it come down over top of me, I seen it go nosedive straight into the ground down here.
By midday, for the first time ever, the Federal Aviation Authority grounded every aircraft in the United States, diverted incoming flights. As of right now, nothing will be flying into or out of here until at least noon Wednesday.
But there is some activity in these skies. Throughout the day, fighter jets have been patrolling the air around Washington. And as we understand it, their orders are quite clear. If a plane enters restricted airspace and cannot be urged out, then it will be shot down. Peter?
Adrienne, still reports from New York tonight that they're having an awful time trying to get towards the rubble to do any kind of rescue operation that may still be possible because they're still fighting fires and still trying to cap gas leaks. What about at the scene of the crash at the Pentagon? What's the latest from there tonight?
Well, earlier we had believed that it was starting to calm down, but recently we've been seeing pictures of flames coming from the Pentagon. So there is a sense that it's not getting better. It might just be getting worse, that the fire within the building itself might be spreading. Whether that's because of the jet fuel or some other cause, we're not clear on yet. We do believe that most of the people who were in the Pentagon have now left the building, but we don't yet know why the fires are burning.
All right, Adrian Arsenault reporting to us tonight from Washington. U.S. President George Bush was not in Washington at the time of the Pentagon attack, but as you may have seen, he is there now. And he's assuring the nation that while a powerful symbol of the U.S. government may have been attacked, the government itself is still operating smoothly. With more on the president's response to this Tuesday of terror, here's the CBC's David Holton. David.
Well, Peter, some are already describing this as the cruelest day in U.S. history. A day that, in a sense, shattered a nation's sense of its own security.
Ready? Kite. Yes, kite. Get ready.
It's just after 9 a.m. President Bush is at an education event when an aide gives him the first whispered news of the New York bombings. His face clouds with anxiety.
At the count of 3, everyone should be on tape.
Minutes later, his first official response.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
For more than 3 hours, though, as U.S. forces at home and abroad are put on the highest alert, nothing more is heard from Bush or any other senior official. Public fears aren't eased when Bush flies to an Air Force base in Louisiana, apparently still unsure that it would be safe to return to Washington.
The resolve of our great nation is being tested. But make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test.
A terrible, terrible tragedy has befallen my nation, but has befallen...
More words of defiance from Secretary of State Colin Powell on a visit to Peru.
They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy.
As thousands flee downtown Washington,
Clear down the whole area.
There's confusion, shock, and disbelief.
We can't move. We can't get anywhere. Everybody's concerned that there might be other buildings targeted.
Now I know what my parents felt like on Pearl Harbor Day.
It's really inconceivable to us that someone would do that, and so you really can't understand the enemy.
But in this case, was the enemy Osama bin Laden? U.S. officials already say bin Laden is their prime suspect, that only his terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda, has the resources and sophistication to carry out today's coordinated attacks. But in Afghanistan, where bin Laden is based, representatives of the Taliban government denied that he's involved.
We strongly condemn it. We want investigation to be carried out.
We could hear detonation coming from that northern area as well.
Later, explosions and rocket fire lit up the night sky around the Afghan capital. Washington quickly denied that this was a U.S. retaliation attack and said the fighting was started by Afghan rebels.
In no way is the United States government connected to those explosions.
This evening, Bush returned to the White House after an unexplained visit to the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Nebraska. This was part of his address to the nation tonight.
I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Bush also ordered federal departments to reopen tomorrow, obviously wanting to send a signal that the government here won't be knocked off course by the bombings. But, no one has any illusions here that it may be a long time before Americans feel safe again. Peter?
David, in a city that can be so often split in a nasty way by partisan matters, what is the sense of unity there in Washington tonight?
Tremendous show of solidarity on Capitol Hill all afternoon, Peter. The Democrats rallying behind, saying they will rally behind President Bush. How long will that last for? That's the issue. Already questions are being asked about why 4 hijackings could take place. What about airport security? Also, and perhaps more patently, why there appears to have been a huge intelligence failure in the fact that even officials here are openly admitting now that they had no advance warning of today's attacks.
All right, David Holton reporting for us tonight from Washington. The shockwaves from today's horror traveled to Ottawa, putting the national capital on alert. Prime Minister Chrétien appealed for calm and said the government had beefed up security here just in case. And he offered the U.S. Canada's sympathy and whatever help it needs. Here's Paul Hunter.
It didn't take long for the effect of the attack to be felt in Ottawa. Heightened security was everywhere. Police doubled their numbers on the streets just in case something were to happen here. At the U.S. Embassy, the biggest and most important American building in Canada, all non-essential workers were told to go home.
Sir, can we get your reaction to what's going on inside?
No comment right now.
Those who worked nearby wondered, could the U.S. Embassy be a target?
I'm really scared. I want to go as far away from here as possible.
The Prime Minister heard about the attack during a breakfast in Ottawa with Saskatchewan Premier Lorne Calvert.
We have talked with the RCMP, with the Solicitor General and the head of the RCMP, and with the Chief of Staff and Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army, and everybody has increased the level of security everywhere.
Planes on the way in. That was made clear in the sky above Whitehorse this afternoon. Canadian fighter jets tracked a Korean plane when there were fears of a possible hijacking. It turned out the plane was simply having fuel troubles, having circled for too long. Those in charge of Canadian security said they were indeed doing all they could.
We have a very strong security intelligence teams in the U.S. and in this country. Obviously, there's been a desperate, terrifying act of terrorism that we will all have to deal with.
I can assure you we are doing everything possible to gather the very best intelligence so that we can use that intelligence to respond appropriately to whatever threat there is to Canadians and obviously other embassies and so on in Canada.
Even so, the Israeli embassy in this Ottawa office building was evacuated anyway, as were all Israeli embassies around the world. Here, nearby office workers were sent home early too, just in case.
Just sheer relief fell over the whole office, you know.
Relief in the end that nothing terrible happened here, with sympathy on behalf of all Canadians for victims of the horrific act.
Canadians show their solidarity with our neighbors, and the news to come when we discover the number of people who died will be probably very tragic.
Some Canadians are already expressing their feelings here at the U.S. Embassy, tonight bringing flowers, cards, and poems in a show of sorrow and sympathy for Americans everywhere. Paul Hunter, CBC News, Ottawa.
The Foreign Affairs Department says it will be at least a day before it's known how many Canadians may have died today. But one Canadian death has been confirmed. Garnet Ace Bailey from Lloydminster, Saskatchewan. His family has confirmed he was a passenger on one of the planes that crashed into the World Trade Center. Bailey was the director of pro scouting for the Los Angeles Kings and a former member of the Edmonton Oilers. He was one of two members of the LA Kings scouting team who was on the plane. Obviously, a very busy night in the national capital. Joining us now from the CBC's Parliamentary Bureau, just on Wellington Street in the nation's capital, Jason Moskowitz, our chief political correspondent. Jason, we've had a sense from Paul's item what's been happening in front of the cameras. What do we know about what's been happening away from the cameras, the kind of discussions that have been going on there?
Well, the Prime Minister has spent the day being briefed at 24 Sussex. He talked to the head of the Security Service, the RCMP, the head of the Armed Forces. And because cabinet ministers were across the country and couldn't get here because the airports were closed, he talked to key cabinet ministers on the telephone. The Prime Minister has also offered all the help that Canada can give to the U.S. at this time. He told reporters that he phoned President Bush. He hasn't had an opportunity to speak to him as of yet. And also, Peter, we should point out that there were a series of cancellations today. The Prime Minister was supposed to go to Halifax. He was supposed to be there tonight, in fact, at a fundraising dinner. He canceled that this morning. The Prime Minister of Slovakia was to visit Canada. That trip was canceled. And the Prime Minister was to go to Stockholm on Thursday. 13 other countries were to be represented at this conference on globalization and new technologies. That, too, was canceled. As for New York City next week, a special session at the United Nations. No one knows yet whether that will be canceled as well.
Already speculation in the United States that we're going to see a very different kind of air travel system in the days ahead, the years ahead now as a result of what happened today. The same kind of speculation one assumes must be going around Ottawa as well about the impact of what happened today in terms of the way we live our lives in the future.
Certainly, the RCMP will be at every airport in the country as never before. in the days ahead when the airports do open and Canadians and Americans and perhaps people all over the world will go through security the likes of which they've never seen.
Now, of course, the House has not been sitting this week. It reopens after the summer break next week, but reaction from other political leaders today?
Well, it's the same as the Prime Minister, just this horrifying expression of grief, regret, and everything that goes with it, Peter.
All right, Jason Moskowitz reporting to us tonight from Parliament Hill in the nation's capital. Many Canadians may want to help Americans on a personal level. The Canadian Blood Services says there will be an urgent need for blood donations in the coming days. To find out the location of clinics and hours of operation, you can call 1-888-2DONATE. And to check on Canadians who may have been caught in the attacks, Foreign Affairs has a 24-hour emergency service. That number is 1-800-387-3124. Please be advised, both numbers are extremely busy. As we've mentioned, soon after the carnage began, the call for help was raised. And as Matthew Pace reports, people in this country were quick to answer it.
They heard the news and saw the images, then lined up to help. Giving blood in Vancouver.
We've had an unbelievable response from our donors.
In Ottawa.
Horrified. It felt like you're looking at a movie, but it's obviously not.
In Calgary.
Really wanted to, give and do what I had to do from this end.
Canadians doing what they had to do to help their closest neighbors.
There's going to be a need for immediate care and comfort. These people have obviously suffered tremendous shocks to their system.
That will direct the operation on a national level.
The Canadian Red Cross is coordinating much of the relief effort.
Tracing service, can I help you?
Helping Canadians find American friends and relatives who may have been caught in the violence.
They really want to know, are their family members involved? Are they hurt? Can they help them?
But mostly they're doing whatever they're asked to do.
Coordination is the key thing. The important thing in terms of help coming in from the outside is that it comes through the appropriate channels and that they coordinate that.
Ontario Premier Mike Harris says people in his province and others are ready to pitch in.
We have offered assistance to the United States and New York governments. I have instructed all branches of the provincial government that Ontario will provide whatever support is needed.
Doctors, nurses, emergency workers are all prepared to offer their support.
The first and foremost thing that we'll look at is whether we can offer any assistance in the healthcare field because the priority becomes on the living.
So people such as Aliyah Galani are just waiting for the call.
If I can just help one person, it'll be a lot, but I know it's going to be a lot. I know maybe we're going to work like 16 hours or 18 hours a day when we go there, and I'm ready for that.
Ready to help out in a relief effort that's only just begun. Matthew Pace, CBC News, Montreal.
It has been a chaotic day at Canadian airports. All flights out were cancelled and hundreds of flights headed for the U.S. landed here instead. As the CBC's Susan Ormiston reports, airports and passengers are finding it hard to cope.
It's awful. I'm afraid it's the end of the world.
Just one passenger on hundreds of aircraft destined for the U.S., but rerouted to Canadian airports. This man in Toronto hosted 200 New York guests at his daughter's wedding last night. They're stranded.
The groom's sister left a 4-week-old child with a nurse who they can't even get through. The nurse is supposed to leave. The phones are all tied up. It's total chaos.
By mid-morning, all airports in Canada were closed. All scheduled flights cancelled.
Our priority has been to receive diverted flights that were bound to destinations within the U.S.
The same everywhere. In Halifax, 7,000 travelers stuck, many still on the tarmac tonight. In Newfoundland, up to 15,000 unexpected passengers.
City, Gander, oh.
Vancouver took the load of Asian flights. The massive effort got thanks from Washington.
So we owe our Canadian neighbors a debt of gratitude for helping us as we redirected.
Many passengers coming off the flights here in Toronto had very few details of what had happened. They were confused and frustrated by the change in their travel plans. Their shock would come later.
Total shock and disbelief sounds like something out of a movie.
They turned off TVs at Pearson Airport, but in Gander, stranded travelers were horrified.
There's the plane. You can't miss that.
All over, passengers had to wait hours for luggage and then try to get a rental car, a bus, or a room. These travelers herded into a hotel ballroom. There are no more rooms.
Back on the other side of the fence, please.
Airports were on high security alert. Tactical police on patrol, dogs and bomb detection equipment in use, and in the air, too, tighter security. Unlike a weather delay or an airline strike, travelers weren't as much testy as nervous.
I just want to get out of here. I feel like a sitting duck, to be quite honest.
Even the airport chaplain had a busy day.
Every few feet, somebody would stop and talk to us. Just wanted to talk. Just wanted to let out steam.
Transport Canada will decide when planes will resume flying. For now, Canadian airports are still closed and travelers' plans in disarray.
The world's not what it was 24 hours ago.
Susan Ormiston, CBC News, Toronto.
Traffic at many of Canada's border crossings has slowed to a crawl as officials check every car and every traveller. Ian Hannah-Mansing, the CBC's Canada Now anchor, reports from the crossing near White Rock, British Columbia.
At the Peace Arch border crossing atop the monument to the longest undefended border in the world, two flags at half-mast, half-staff. A symbol of the tragedy that today trumped the optimism of the words inscribed on the arch. May these gates never be closed. This gate to the United States was sealed shut for about 20 minutes this morning. And when it reopened, it was at the highest level of security, what customs officers call a Code 1. The last time border checks were this thorough was on the eve of the Millennium celebrations in 1999, after Ahmed Rassam was caught trying to smuggle explosives from British Columbia to Washington state. U.S. citizens were allowed back into their country today, slowly. Most non-Americans, at this crossing at least, were turned away. These Canadians were headed to Oregon for a convention.
And then he said, I'm sorry, you cannot go through, the very easy thing. Only Americans are allowed to go through.
On the Canadian side, heightened security as well. And at a crossing where usually more than 300 cars an hour would stream past, by midday, only about 75 vehicles each hour were trickling through. One veteran police officer said he's never seen this level of security at the border.
I've been policing in this area for over the course of 35 years. As far as on an emergent reaction, no, I've never encountered this type of slowdown.
It was a similar scene at some of the other major crossings. The Windsor-Detroit Tunnel was shut down for about 5 hours. And on the Ambassador Bridge, massive backups. At Niagara Falls, no complaints about the slow traffic, but outrage from Americans over the attacks.
Whoever did it, I hope they really get the crap knocked out of them. I mean, they will, as the Americans stand together.
It's a sad day for America. Still proud to be an American, but we need to straighten this out real quick and go after the parties. All-out war, that's what it is, just like Pearl Harbor.
At this hour, the Peace Arch crossing, about a 45-minute drive from Vancouver, it is very quiet. It is, of course, the supper hour here on the west coast of Canada, and usually it would be much busier here, but probably only about a dozen cars waiting to get into both the United States and Canada. Peter?
Ian, we've heard about the Code 1 alert on the American side of the border. What is the situation in terms of security on the Canadian side right now?
Well, many of our viewers are used to coming to the border crossings, coming back into Canada, and often simply being asked, are you Canadian, and being let through. A much different story tonight as cars approach the border crossing on the Canadian side. First of all, there's an immigration officer there. That's quite unusual. That officer is trying to verify identification. So for those who don't have passports, say they have driver's licenses, for example, the immigration officer often asks a couple of follow-up questions to try to verify that information. And then a gauntlet of customs officers are in the next lane, and we've seen as many as 3 or 4 going through glove compartments, trunks, and boxes in the back of pickup trucks. So at this hour, Peter, at least at this border crossing, it's much quieter and much more secure than usual. Peter?
All right, Ian, thanks very much. Ian Hannah-Mansing reporting to us from the BC-Washington state border. Well, we'll be joining more coverage in just a moment. we're back. The global reaction to the death and destruction was swift. Almost every world leader lined up behind the U.S. to condemn the attacks. And as Don Murray reports, they were also bracing for trouble of their own.
The world watched transfixed. This was London. It could have been any major city in Europe this afternoon. Television pictures gathered crowds. They evoked curiosity, disbelief, and then horror. Traders were moved from the London Stock Exchange. They too watched the televised pictures in disbelief. Some left one of London's main financial office buildings. American firms sent their workers home. Rapidly, police forces around the continent were put on alert. Security was noticeably heavier at the American embassy in London. By the end of the afternoon, the impact was most obvious at airports. London's Heathrow was filled with passengers whose planes, headed for the U.S., had been turned back in the air. The chorus of condemnation from European political leaders was swift and unanimous. Germany's Chancellor Gerhard Schröder talked of the revulsion his government and his country felt at these attacks. Russian President Vladimir Putin described the attacks as an evil blow against all civilized people.
И то, что произошло сегодня, лишний раз подчеркивает актуальность.
What happened today, he says, underlines the importance of Russia's proposal to unite all the forces of international society to fight terrorism. Britain's Prime Minister Tony Blair emerged from an emergency meeting of his senior ministers to say his country would stand shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. in a crusade to eliminate such attacks.
This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world. The people who perpetrate it have no regard whatever for the sanctity or value of human life. And we, the democracies of the world, must come together to defeat it and eradicate it.
This evening, NATO ambassadors met in Brussels just hours after all non-essential NATO employees had been sent home from the alliance's headquarters. Tomorrow, the European foreign ministers will meet in emergency session. But this furious round of diplomatic discussion barely conceals the obvious. No one in power on this side of the Atlantic has any real idea how this happened or what will happen next. Don Murray, CBC News, London.
Now from Europe to the Middle East, a region that's no stranger to suicide attacks. But the scope of today's events was shocking by any standards. Still, there were pockets of Palestinians who celebrated today's attacks. Joining us with the latest from the Middle East, the CBC's Neil MacDonald. Neil.
Peter, the mood here in Jerusalem, and I think it's safe to say in the Palestinian territories and elsewhere in the Arab world, is a somber one. There's a feeling here of great foreboding. If, and I say if, these attacks were perpetrated by Arab extremists, then Israel is inevitably drawn into the equation, as are the Palestinians and other Arab states. For the past year, especially since the election of President Bush, Israel and the United States of America have become synonymous in the mind of the Arab street. To a great many Arabs, both countries are now bitter enemies. And that explains some of the scenes we saw here today. In Arab East Jerusalem, groups of people took to the street, celebrating, toasting Osama bin Laden, and generally hailing whomever managed to inflict such a lethal blow against Israel's closest ally and greatest protector. There were similar celebrations in the cities of the West Bank and in the Palestinian refugee camps of Lebanon. Most Arab leaders, though, understanding the sheer foolishness of taunting Americans at a time like this, were greatly restrained.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President, President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
Palestinian extremist groups, though, issued cold denials and took the opportunity to lecture the United States. We are opposed to U.S. oppression, said this leader of Hamas, itself a group that has dispatched suicide bombers. We call upon the U.S. to take fair stands and not take Israel's side.
We deny our responsibility, but we call upon the American administration to review their attitude and their policy towards the Palestinian question, because this policy arouses the anger and the hatred of our people and of all Arab and Islamic peoples.
The terror attacks. Israeli leaders universally expressed grief and condolences and declared a national day of mourning.
The fight against terror is an international struggle of the free world against the forces of darkness who seek to destroy our liberty and our way of life.
This was not an attack just against America. It was an attack against civilization, an attempt to bring us back to a jungle where everybody will be full of fear.
On the popular Israeli political program, Popolitica, an Israeli general called for the immediate liquidation of Yasser Arafat.
What the American people
and from a former prime minister,
Israel. We here in Israel have been standing and fighting at the front line against terrorism for years. But now terrorism is struck at the heart of freedom. And this is exactly what this battle is. It's a battle between the forces of tyranny and terrorism and the forces of freedom and democracy.
And that, no doubt, is how the Arabs of the Middle East now fear the lines will be drawn, with them cast irretrievably as terrorists and the word Islam synonymous with atrocity in the Western mind. It's probably safe to say that most people here, Arab and Jew, now feel their lives have changed. And that the geopolitical lines here have shifted reality. Certainly, the current Palestinian intifada, the uprising, is going to be seen in quite a different light, beginning now. Peter?
Neil, at any time a major event has an impact on the Middle East, you have to weigh carefully the impact that it can have on either side in the historic dispute. There seems to be a sense that as awful as this is, the event that's happened in the United States today, that on the side of Israel expressing its shock and horror at what's happened, it almost seems that they feel that this can have an impact for them of a beneficial nature.
Well, Peter, you heard the sorrow and the sympathy that was expressed by Israeli leaders today, and it's genuine, but I think at the same time there is sort of a glimmer of grim satisfaction that the rest of the world has met Israel's enemy, and in a very sudden way. You know, and I think Israeli leaders are hoping that the world will close ranks with them. That's what they're asking for. I think to a certain extent that has begun. Simply the use of the word terrorism. Western news agencies and governments have been chary about using that word with regard to this conflict up to now, viewing it largely as a political construct. That's changed. The word terrorism is certainly on our style book now, and it's being used widely by Western news agencies. And I think just that is the start of the world's perception perhaps growing a little bit closer to Israel's about this sort of thing. And that will certainly be welcome to the leadership here.
All right, and underlining, as you have been throughout the day, I know it's early tomorrow morning in Jerusalem right now in terms of the time schedule here in this side of the Atlantic, but underlining, as you have all day, still no indication who was responsible for this, all kinds of fingers being pointed, but at this hour, still no firm indication of who is responsible. Neil MacDonald reporting to us tonight from Jerusalem. Now, more reaction from on the ground in the United States. Buffalo, New York is just a stone's throw from Ontario. Dan Bjarnason was in that city today. He saw people stunned, people outraged, and people desperate to help their neighbors.
In Buffalo, New York, as word of the catastrophe rippled across the city, security was tightened at many government centers, including City Hall, which shut down, and flags were lowered one by one. In the handful of shopping plazas that stayed open, there were few actual shoppers. Those few were mostly drawn to electronics stores, where they were glued to TV newscasts as the full horror grew by the hour.
It's been reported, our David Ensor has reported that
the Red Cross in Buffalo was holding blood donor clinics today, never dreaming the events in New York and Washington would become so relevant. As it turned out, this clinic was swamped. Tony Dell.
We had no way of planning for this kind of event or demand, and we didn't have adequate staff. We didn't have adequate beds. We were unprepared. But in less than 12 hours, we have beefed up everything and we're ready to collect and process an awful lot more blood.
By coincidence, an association of several hundred healthcare workers from all across the U.S. was at a convention in Buffalo. A delegation arrived at the donor clinic wanting to figure out how they could all give blood.
I came today to donate blood to help whoever I can. Because if this was me, if this was happening to me, I'd want people to help me, definitely.
This wasn't something you planned on doing.
Drawing blood today?
When you got up this morning, you thought, let's go give blood. That didn't happen.
No. I've never donated blood in my life.
Really?
Really.
And you're in the health field.
Right. I'd love to draw blood, but I don't like to give it. But I would.
So why is today special?
Because of everything that's happened. If they need our help, we're willing to give it.
Right now, everybody's kind of living in this movie that we don't know, okay, how's it going to end, that sort of thing. And we've all talked about that at different times today, how it feels very surreal. You don't feel like it's actually happening. And you don't know, is anything else going to happen or what's going to happen if it does.
For most here in Buffalo, the mood was not one of terror, but of rage.
If I could re-enlist, I would, because I'd like to get back at the person that took the innocent lives today for no reason at all. That's got me very upset.
Others counted themselves lucky they were here in Buffalo today and not in New York or Washington, although there was great empathy with those caught up in the cities at the center of the disasters.
My dad works there, so that was my main concern, to get in touch with him and see if he was still okay or alive. And after 3 hours, I was finally able to get in touch with him and found out that he was out to breakfast across the street when it happened. Luckily, thank God.
Dan Bjarnason, CBC News, Buffalo.
From Buffalo, let's take that live shot we've been showing you throughout the day. It's now night in New York City. The skyline of the island of Manhattan, dramatically different now, minus the twin towers of the World Trade Center. It looks like an eerie calm settling over New York tonight, but we can tell you that deep in the heart of the southern end of Manhattan, desperate rescue operations are underway. Trying to get near the area where the towers collapsed is still one of the biggest headaches, as firefighters, rescue operators, still trying to get rid of fires that are causing all sorts of problems and structurally unsound buildings that are on the verge of collapse in that immediate area. But we are starting to hear some incredible stories, reports indicating that there are people inside the rubble, trapped and alive, using cell phones to call relatives to say they are there, trapped inside the rubble. These kind of reports are at this moment sketchy, but it does offer hope, and the prayers that have been asked for by all who have been watching these stories throughout today for those who are still trapped inside the rubble. If some are alive, which now reports seem to indicate that is possible, our prayers are with them as rescue teams try to get to that scene, to get through the rubble and get to the people trapped inside. Horrific totals expected as the casualties will begin to mount when the rubble starts to clear. Remember, the twin towers of the World Trade Center house on a normal day anywhere between 20 to 50,000 people. 110 stories of offices, 2 towers. The questions of who carried out today's attacks and how burn fiercely in the minds of Americans tonight. But we do know that in the recent past, Canada has been used as a base for attempted terror attacks on the United States. The CBC's Terrence McKenna has been preparing a documentary on the subject and has this report for us tonight.
The most haunting foreshadowing of today's terror attack happened in Marseille, France in 1994. French commandos stormed an Air France jet which had been hijacked by Algerian Islamic militants. All the hijackers were killed. 159 hostages were freed. 7 had been killed. French authorities said the hijackers wanted to crash the plane fully loaded with fuel into Paris, if possible, into the Eiffel Tower. The trail from that case led French investigating magistrate Jean-Louis Bruguière to uncover a worldwide network of Islamic terrorists. His work has brought him to Canada and the United States.
This study is spreading over the world like a web.
So it's very difficult to grasp this new threat. But it's very, very dangerous because their target is very different. They try to target not only France, but America.
French investigators established links that led from the 1994 hijacking through the Paris subway bombs in 1995 and 96. And the trail eventually led them to a group of terrorists in Montreal, which included Ahmed Ressam, the man arrested at the American border with powerful explosives in the trunk of his car in 1999. Salim Jiwa covered the Ressam case for the Vancouver province.
Well, I see the Ressam situation as a precursor of what was to come. I see that as I mean, the astonishing part is what Ressam was saying was the number of people who are trained. For example, he stated that 60 people are ready and on standby in Italy. He named a number of groups in Sweden, number of people in Germany. So I saw that as a precursor. I was talking to a security source in the United States and just a month ago, and he indicated that the U.S. was very nervous still that something would happen and they would be unable to stop it. He said to me that these people are not going to stop, and you know it.
Ahmed Ressam easily obtained a false Canadian passport and used it to travel to the city of Peshawar in the northwest frontier province of Pakistan. There he made contact with the Osama bin Laden organization and entered a terrorist training camp in nearby Afghanistan for months of instruction in bomb-making and assassination techniques. Islamic militants from many nations are trained in the Afghanistan camps. The bin Laden organization has been monitored for years by the U.S. security apparatus and the Situation Room at the White House. James Steinberg was Deputy National Security Advisor in the Clinton administration.
It's not simply a question of an individual belonging to one particular organization with one particular target, whether it's the GIA in Algeria or the Egyptian Islamic Jihad in Egypt, but rather a kind of loose network of people who have common affiliations, common training, common associations, frequently linked to Afghanistan, which becomes sort of a pool of individuals who may be available to be involved in terrorist operations elsewhere in the world.
The Ressam case has brought to light numerous connections between the Osama bin Laden organization and Canada.
Yes, indeed. There are other names, as you know, people who have direct telephonic links in Canada with Osama bin Laden's right-hand man, Abu Zubaydah. There are people like that in Calgary. There are people like that in Vancouver. There are people like that in Montreal. There are people like that in Toronto. Numerous telephonic links have been found with very sinister people and very dangerous people in Canada.
Suspected terrorists in Canada are monitored by the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, CSIS, and agents like Dan Lambert.
Counterterrorism is the main priority of the CSIS in terms of its mandate. We have 2/3 of our resources are dedicated to counterterrorism. We work extremely closely with the RCMP, with the Department of Justice, with CIC and Customs within Canada, as well as U.S. authorities. And in fact, I mean, we have liaison relationships with 130 different countries and over 250 different agencies.
What's valuable about the Ressam case is that it reinforces the necessity of this kind of cooperation. As you say, there were links in not only between individuals operating in the United States, individuals operating in Canada, but also in Europe. And as we began to uncover them, I think it reinforced among officials involved in law enforcement and intelligence the critical need for this kind of transnational cooperation.
Why would Islamic terrorists come to Canada? David Harris is former Chief of Strategic Planning at the Canadian Security and Intelligence Agency.
I think in terms of Islamic extremists in Canada, they regard the proximity of Canada to the U.S. as making Canada a kind of Islamic extremist aircraft carrier for the launching of major assaults against the U.S. mainland. And that's something we've got to remember.
Today's massive coordinated attack shows a level of sophistication well beyond what had been anticipated or predicted in the North American intelligence community. Most intelligence analysts thought a conspiracy of this magnitude would show up in the massive wiretapping and monitoring of suspected terrorists.
Indeed, this is a complete failure of intelligence. the United States, Canada, and allied intelligence services for a long time will be dissecting how such a major conspiracy that must have used the airwaves, may have used the internet as a contact point, could get through and be carried out without anybody waking up. This is havoc that has been created, and I suppose many heads will roll, and there will be lots of postmortems conducted on how such a major conspiracy could be concealed.
Congresswoman Jane Harman served on the U.S. Counterterrorism Intelligence Committee and has long pleaded for more resources to deal with international terrorism.
What is very worrisome is the goals of terrorists have changed. It used to be that terrorists would try to kill a few people and make a political point. But as we stated in this terrorism report that I worked on last year, the goal no longer is a seat at the table. The goal is to blow up the table.
Peter, there was a lot of finger-pointing at Canada after the Ahmed Rassam case, and it really led to a lot of concern about how easy it was for him to take advantage of the refugee and immigration rules in Canada, and there was a lot of pressure on Canada to tighten up. There's no indication that there's any connection between Canada and the terrorists that performed the attack today. But in spite of that, I think you can see a lot more pressure on Canada and America's other allies to tighten up and to make sure you're not providing a safe haven for terrorists.
All right, Terence, thanks very much. Terence McKenna joining us tonight from Montreal, and he is, as we have told you, preparing a major documentary on this issue, which will be running in the weeks to come on the National. For more now on who may be responsible for today's attacks and how the U.S. is likely to respond, John Thompson, a security expert with the Mackenzie Institute in Toronto, and in Kingston, Ontario tonight, Harold Claypack, a professor of war studies at the Royal Military College. Professor Claypack, let me begin with you. Can you give us a sense of what you would assume is going on in the American intelligence community right now in trying to determine who's responsible for what happened today?
Who's responsible in the sense of the enemy side? Well, I think there's a huge effort, obviously, undertaken. There's a lot of people very, very confused. They are filling in all the gaps that they can find, and they're going after, I think it's already fairly clear, the most obvious sources of this sort of sophistication and this sort of operation. I think once having said that, though, the first thing to remember is that this is a very easy thing in some ways to mount as well. That is to say, given enough determination and enough drive on the side of the terrorists and some funds and some sophistication, you can do a lot of damage. So that there will be a lot of work being done, but it's not going to result in very much very quickly, I shouldn't think.
All right, John Thompson, your thoughts on this angle too, because I think for most of us it is hard to imagine just what kind of resources the intelligence community can use at a time like this to try and determine real proof of who was involved. What do we know?
Well, for a start, the attack occurred in the United States and originated inside the United States, or it appears to. The criminal activity, the hijackings and all that occurred in the United States. So the lead investigative body for this has to be the FBI. And they're the ones who will be beginning. And I suspect they've already retrieved airport surveillance tapes from Boston and Newark, and are trying to compare faces to names and try and get an idea of who actually was responsible for the hijacking of these aircraft. And that gives them a lead point that they can work with and start to sort of tug on the strings and see where they lead. After that, forensics from the attack sites, but it's going to be a long time before they get evidence out of the World Trade Center rubble.
Now, we also always hear these stories about the sophisticated satellite technology the Americans have at hand in terms of monitoring overseas conversations and conversations between people who they are trying to keep tabs on. One assumes that kind of operation is used as well. John?
Well, it's true, but they've had a hard time processing the material they get. That's one of the recent complaints about the NSA in the United States, that the computers that analyze all the data they get have been crashing and been having problems. They haven't been modernized. The other thing is that some of the Islamic fundamentalist groups are very well aware of American capabilities and have been observing very simple things like signals intelligence, being very careful about what they say and when they say it, and how they say it, using, for example, veiled speech to refer indirectly to what they might be doing. Say the delivery of explosives might be referred to as, say, something over a cell phone, you know, did you get my flowers that I sent you? And let's see how the NSA interprets that. A lot of people might be making remarks about the CIA as well, but the CIA, like a lot of other intelligence organizations around the world, their first reliance is on the open press. And then after that, their agents tend to behave much the same way that a reporter would. You know, going to an area and going with your eyes open and your ears open and talking to people open and above board. Sort of the use of spies for human intelligence is very rare and very difficult, especially in the Islamic fundamentalist community. These are people who know each other already, and they know each other very well.
All right, Professor Klepak, based on past terrorist acts, does what we know about what happened today bear the marks of Osama bin Laden, the person who many are suggesting already is probably at the top of the list of prime suspects for this?
In some ways, yes, in the sense that it has been expensive, it has required sophistication, etc., but it's not, again, all that difficult. If you take into consideration, for example, what it might have been, I think one thing that's being left out of a lot of this discussion is that there are much more sophisticated and much more technologically advanced things that terrorists can do. And the thought that by improving our intelligence services alone, our defense services alone, we're going to be able to defeat this is really in many ways dreaming in technicolor. The fact is that we didn't have a gas attack of a massive level as many people feared after Tokyo subway. We didn't have biological warfare yet, and this is an absolute monstrous and ferocious and incredible in terms of its scope, this attack. But in some ways it was traditional in the sense that, at least, that we have had kidnappings of aircraft or taking overs of aircraft, hijackings. We have had aircraft crash into buildings. We've had car bombs. None of that side of things is new. And so in a way this may be a chance for us to get a lesson in before even worse things happen. I personally don't think we're going to be able to beat this, but we can improve our record with it in the face of this disaster.
All right, joining us now, our conversation, Rex Brynan, a professor of political science at McGill University. Rex, what is your sense on the Osama bin Laden question? Do you think his group could have been involved in this, carried out this attack? Oh, I'm sorry. We thought we were able to get through to Rex Brynan, but unfortunately he's not there. So let me carry on that same question to John Thompson in Toronto. The Osama bin Laden question, any doubt in your mind that he could have been able to do this?
Some doubt. I mean, some of the characteristics of the attack seem typical of other attacks associated with his network, particularly in this case, the very successful attempt to cause massive loss of human life. And the planning behind the attack seems, again, consistent. But the bin Laden network has actually seldom used suicide bombers. In fact, the only case I can think of off the top of my head is the attack on a U.S. warship last year. Of course, beyond that, most terrorists, in conventional thinking, like to pull off an operation with a large body count. And I think, in this case, the bin Laden network normally would have been content with the destruction wrought to the World Trade Center. But these other attacks, the attack in Washington and the second attempted attack on what might be Camp David, that's something else altogether. A phased series of attacks aimed after the economic damage and human loss at the World Trade Center, this phased attack at American officials and American symbols in Washington, that's something else. That's something that hasn't been seen before from the bin Laden network.
All right, we're going to have to end our conversation there. John Thompson joining us here in Toronto, Michael Klepak joining us from Kingston, Ontario. We appreciate your time, both of you, tonight. Thanks very much. Coming up on the 10 o'clock hour here in central Canada, top of the clocks at the rest of the country as well, except, of course, in Newfoundland, where it's 11:30 at night. We're going to continue our special edition of The National here from Toronto. More examination of the story that is dominating the news at this hour.